She sat in her drawing room on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by servants who dressed her, fed her, and managed every detail of her existence. Yet she was more trapped than any of them. She wore gowns that cost thousands of dollars, but couldn't control a single penny of her own money. She attended the most exclusive balls in New York society, but found them suffocating and meaningless. She was born into one of the oldest, most prestigious families in America, groomed from birth to be the perfect society wife, and she spent her entire adult life systematically dismantling that world in the most devastating way possible by telling the truth about it. Edith Wharton was the ultimate insider who became the ultimate exposé artist, and she did it not with scandal sheets or journalism, but with novels that were so precisely observed, so psychologically penetrating, and so ruthlessly honest that they peeled back the gilded veneer of high society to reveal the cruelty, hypocrisy, and human cost underneath. She knew every unspoken rule because she'd been forced to follow them. She understood every subtle social gesture because her survival had depended on reading them correctly. And she used that intimate knowledge to create some of the most searing social criticism ever written, all while the very people she was exposing invited her to dinner and praised her literary talent without quite realizing she was writing about them. This is the story of how one woman, armed only with a pen and an incisive mind, exposed an entire era, and how her novels remain the most accurate, unflinching portrait we have of what the Gilded Age really was, behind the ballrooms and the jewels. This is how Edith Wharton exposed the Gilded Age, one devastating page at a time. Edith Newbold Jones was born in 1862 into the kind of family that didn't need to prove anything to anyone because their position was simply assumed. The Joneses were old New York aristocracy, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so long that they'd forgotten when the money was made or how. They were part of that narrow circle of interrelated families, the Astors, the Schermerhorns, the Rhinelanders, who considered themselves the true arbiters of society, the ones who looked down on the new millionaires as vulgar upstarts. When someone said, "keeping up with the Joneses," they were literally talking about Edith's family. Her father, George Frederick Jones, had inherited enough wealth that he never needed to work. Her mother, Lucretia, was obsessed with social position, with following every rule of etiquette, with maintaining the family's standing in society. And into this world of rigid expectations and suffocating conformity, a daughter was born who would turn out to be wildly, inconveniently intelligent. From the beginning, Edith didn't fit. She was intellectually curious in a world that viewed intellectual women with suspicion. She wanted to read serious literature when girls of her class were supposed to confine themselves to light novels and poetry. She wanted to write, actually write and publish, when respectable women might compose private verses, but certainly didn't seek publication like common professional authors. She asked questions when she was supposed to accept. She observed when she was supposed to simply participate. And she noticed, God did she notice, every hypocritical gesture, every unspoken rule designed to maintain power, every cruelty dressed up as social necessity. She was being trained to be an ornament, a beautiful object to be displayed in society, and married off to solidify family connections. But she had the mind of a novelist and the observational skills of an anthropologist. The very training that was meant to make her a successful society woman, teaching her to read every subtle social cue, to understand the unspoken hierarchies, to navigate the complex rules of her world, ended up giving her exactly the skills she needed to dissect that world in her fiction. Her childhood was materially comfortable, but emotionally cold. Her mother was distant and critical, never showing affection, always finding fault. There's a heartbreaking story Edith told later about being a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, and making up, as she called it, telling herself stories as she paced around with a book in her hands, pretending to read from it, but actually creating elaborate narratives in her head. Her mother walked in one day, saw her pacing and talking to herself, and asked what she was doing. When Edith explained that she was making up stories, her mother responded with something like, "I never knew a child could be so tiresome," and told her to stop immediately. That casual cruelty, that dismissal of her creativity and imagination was typical of Lucretia Jones's parenting. She was raising Edith to be socially successful, and anything that didn't serve that purpose was not just discouraged but actively suppressed. Intellectual curiosity, creativity, emotional expression, all of it was tiresome and inappropriate for a girl of her class. Edith's education was typical for girls of her era and background, which is to say it was designed to make her marriageable rather than knowledgeable. She had governesses who taught her languages. She learned French and German and Italian. She studied art and music. She was taught to move gracefully and speak properly and dress appropriately. But she was never given systematic education in literature, history, or philosophy. Her real education came from her father's library, where she spent hours reading everything she could find. She read voraciously and without much guidance, absorbing literature, poetry, history, philosophy, theology, anything she could get her hands on. Her father was more sympathetic to her intellectual interests than her mother, but even he saw them as an eccentricity to be indulged rather than cultivated. The expectation was always that she would grow out of this phase and settle into her proper role as a society wife. When Edith was 16, her family published, privately and anonymously, a collection of her poetry titled Verses. This wasn't meant as a serious literary debut, but as a kind of vanity project, the sort of thing wealthy families did to indulge a daughter's hobby. But it showed that even at 16, Edith was serious about writing. The poems weren't particularly good, as she herself later acknowledged, but they showed ambition and craft. She was trying to be a real poet, not just composing occasional verses. Around the same time, she wrote a novella called Fast and Loose that mimicked the society novels she'd been reading. Again, it wasn't particularly accomplished, but it showed she was teaching herself the craft of fiction through imitation and practice. These early efforts were kept private or semi-private because it would have been inappropriate for a girl of her background to seek real publication. Writing was acceptable as a genteel hobby, like watercolor painting or embroidery, but professional authorship was something else entirely. At 17, Edith was presented to society, making her official debut and entering the marriage market. And here's where we see the full machinery of Gilded Age society in action. Edith was beautiful in an era that prized a very specific kind of beauty. Tall, slender, with regular features, graceful movement, and perfect posture. She had been trained in every accomplishment expected of a society girl. She could make conversation in multiple languages, she could play the piano, she could manage a household, she knew every rule of etiquette. She was, by all external measures, exactly what she was supposed to be. But the marriage market was brutal for women, and even women with every advantage faced intense pressure and limited options. You had maybe 2 or 3 seasons to make a good match before you started to be considered passed over. Your parents, especially your mother, would be selecting appropriate candidates, men from good families with sufficient wealth and social standing. Your own preferences barely mattered. Love was nice if it happened, but it wasn't the point. The point was to make an appropriate alliance that maintained or enhanced your family's social position. Edith became engaged to Harry Stevens, the son of a prominent New York family, but the engagement was broken off, apparently due to his mother's opposition. There are hints that there was more to the story, possibly concerns about Harry's mental stability or his family's financial situation. But the details were kept private, as such things always were. The broken engagement was socially damaging for Edith, marking her as somehow problematic or difficult. She was now a girl who'd been engaged and not married, which raised questions. Was something wrong with her? Had she behaved inappropriately? The whispers and speculation were probably more painful than the loss of the relationship itself. She spent the next few years in social limbo, still attending functions, but without clear prospects, watching other girls her age marry, while she remained at home with increasingly critical parents who saw her as failing at her primary purpose. Then, in 1885, when Edith was 23, she married Edward Teddy Robbins Wharton. On paper, it looked like a reasonable match. Teddy came from an old Boston family. He had sufficient means. He was socially acceptable. But the marriage was a disaster almost from the beginning, though it took years for that to become fully apparent. Teddy was 12 years older than Edith, amiable but intellectually limited, interested in sports and dogs and country life, but utterly uninterested in literature, art, or ideas. They had nothing in common intellectually or emotionally. The marriage was never consummated, or at least not successfully so. They had no children, and there are strong hints in Edith's later writings and letters that the sexual side of the marriage was deeply disappointing and possibly traumatic for her. She went into marriage knowing almost nothing about sex, as girls of her background were kept in complete ignorance, and discovered too late that she was in a relationship with a man who either couldn't or wouldn't fulfill that aspect of marriage. She was trapped in a marriage that left her emotionally and intellectually isolated, bound to a man she didn't love and couldn't talk to, playing the role of society wife while feeling utterly alone. For the first few years of her marriage, Edith tried to make it work by throwing herself into the expected roles. She managed their households, they had homes in New York and Newport. She entertained, she made social calls, she did everything a woman of her position was supposed to do. But she was suffocating. The meaningless social rounds, the endless dinners and balls where the same people said the same things, the complete lack of intellectual stimulation, it was crushing her. And she began to notice how many other women seemed equally trapped. The brilliant conversationalist who could only display her wit in carefully controlled contexts. The woman with artistic talent who was never allowed to develop it seriously. The unhappily married woman who couldn't leave because divorce was social death. The widow who discovered she had no legal rights to her own late husband's money. Edith was living inside a system that looked beautiful from the outside, all those gorgeous gowns and glittering jewels and magnificent houses, but that was actually a cage that limited women's lives in fundamental ways. She started writing seriously in her late 20s and early 30s, initially working on short stories and collaborating on a book about interior decoration, The Decoration of Houses, published in 1897 with architect Ogden Codman Jr. The book was ostensibly about design principles, but it was also a critique of the vulgar excess of nouveau riche decoration. Edith had strong opinions about taste, and she used the book to argue for classical restraint and proportion against the overstuffed, overdecorated style popular among the newly wealthy. It was her first published book under her own name, and it was successful enough to establish her as someone with something to say. But more importantly, it gave her confidence that she could publish, that there was an audience for her work, that she could be more than just a society wife. Her first collection of short stories, The Greater Inclination, was published in 1899 when she was 37. The stories dealt with society, with marriages, with the constraints on women's lives, and they showed a sharp eye for social detail and psychological nuance. Critics noticed, here was a society woman who could actually write, and who was writing about society from the inside with uncommon insight. The book sold well enough to encourage her to continue. She followed it with more story collections and then her first novel, The Valley of Decision, in 1902. It was a historical novel set in 18th century Italy, showing her love of European culture and history, but it wasn't drawn from her own experience and didn't have the power of her later work. Everything changed in 1905 with The House of Mirth, the novel that established Edith Wharton as a major American writer and remains one of the most devastating portrayals of Gilded Age society ever written. This was the book where she took everything she knew about her world and crafted it into a tragedy that was also a comprehensive social critique. The novel tells the story of Lily Bart, a beautiful, accomplished young woman from a good family who has fallen on hard times after her father's financial ruin and death. Lily is 29 as the novel opens, which in Gilded Age terms made her dangerously close to being past her prime in the marriage market. She has no money of her own, no way to support herself, and only one real option for securing her future: marry well. The entire novel follows her attempts to do just that, while also trying to maintain some authenticity, some sense of self, some control over her own life. And we watch as she makes a series of small choices, each one individually defensible, each one slightly compromising her social position until she finds herself completely outside society with no way back in and no way to survive. What makes the House of Mirth so powerful is that Wharton doesn't present Lily as a victim of individual villains, but as a victim of an entire social system. Yes, there are people who treat her badly, men who use her, women who gossip about her, social climbers who sacrifice her to advance themselves. But the real antagonist is the system itself, a social order that gives women like Lily no real options, that judges them entirely on their marketability in the marriage market, that provides no safety net for those who fall, and that punishes any deviation from its narrow rules with social death. Lily is destroyed not because she's weak or foolish, but because she's caught between incompatible demands. She needs to marry for money to survive, but she also has pride and a desire for something more than a mercenary marriage. She's been trained to be decorative but not productive, to charm but not to work, to be desirable but not to desire too openly. Every skill she has is only valuable in the context of catching a husband, and when that fails, she has nothing to fall back on. Wharton shows us Lily's world in excruciating detail. The house parties at country estates where the real business of matchmaking happens. The careful calculation of who sits next to whom at dinner. The gossip that can destroy a reputation in an afternoon. The way money determines everything, from who's invited where to who has power in relationships. The absolute necessity of maintaining appearances even when you're desperate. And underlying it all, the complete economic dependence of women on men. Lily can't earn money in any respectable way. The few options available to women of her class, like becoming a governess or companion, would represent such a fall in status that she'd be entirely outside her social world. Actual work, like factory work or shop work, is unthinkable for someone of her background. She's been raised with expensive tastes and no ability to satisfy them herself, and every day that she remains unmarried, her position becomes more precarious. The novel builds to its inevitable tragic conclusion with a kind of terrible logic. Lily makes mistakes, yes, but they're the kind of mistakes that in a just world wouldn't be catastrophic. She accepts loans from a man who isn't her husband or fiancé, compromising herself in the eyes of society. She's seen in compromising situations that she can't adequately explain without betraying others. She defends herself against slander by refusing to use letters that would protect her but destroy someone else. Each choice shows her as fundamentally decent, but decency is not rewarded in this world. The social system doesn't care about actual virtue, only about appearances and marketability. Lily falls from social grace, loses access to the world that's the only one she knows, attempts briefly to work in a hat shop, but lacks the practical skills and stamina for real labor. And eventually, alone and addicted to the sleeping medicine she's been taking, takes a fatal overdose. Whether it's suicide or accidental is left ambiguous, but either way, the system has killed her as surely as if it had put a gun to her head. The House of Mirth was a sensation. It sold over 140,000 copies in its first few months, making it one of the best-selling novels of the decade. Everyone read it. Society women read it, recognizing their world and probably not fully recognizing themselves in its critique. Critics praised it as a masterwork of social observation and psychological realism. Some society people were offended, feeling that Wharton had betrayed her class by exposing its secrets, but many more were fascinated. The novel was discussed everywhere, in drawing rooms and at dinner parties. And suddenly, Edith Wharton was not just a society woman who wrote, but a serious, important novelist. She had arrived as a literary figure, and she'd done it by anatomizing the world she came from with unflinching precision. The success of the House of Mirth gave Wharton financial independence for the first time in her life. She was 43 years old and finally earning her own money. Enough money that she wasn't dependent on her husband or her inheritance. This is hard to overstate in terms of its importance. For a woman of her era and background, economic dependence was simply assumed. Your father supported you until you married, then your husband supported you, and if you were widowed, you lived on whatever he'd left you. The idea that you could support yourself through your own work was radical, and Wharton was doing more than supporting herself. She was earning substantial money, enough to live very well indeed. This changed everything in her marriage and her life. She no longer needed to defer to Teddy, no longer needed to compromise her desires for financial security. She had power, real economic power for the first time. As her literary career flourished, her marriage deteriorated. Teddy had never been intellectually compatible with her, but in the early years, he'd at least been stable and amiable. But around 1908, he began showing signs of serious mental illness, probably bipolar disorder, though it wasn't diagnosed as such at the time. He had wild mood swings, periods of deep depression followed by periods of manic activity. He embezzled money from Edith's trust fund and used it to support a mistress and buy property in Boston. He would disappear for days or weeks. He became verbally abusive. The man who'd been merely boring and incompatible became impossible to live with. Edith's friends and family urged her to leave him, but divorce was still scandalous in her world, especially divorce initiated by a woman. She struggled with the decision for years, trying separations and treatments for Teddy, but finally in 1913, she divorced him. If you're captivated by Edith Wharton's story and want to explore more about the hidden lives and secret rebellions of the Gilded Age, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we're going deep into how Wharton's personal struggles and observations shaped some of the most penetrating social criticism ever written. And trust me, her insights only got sharper from here. The divorce was liberating, but also socially costly. Many of her old New York friends dropped her or treated her coolly. Divorced women were considered suspect in that world, and even though everyone knew Teddy had been impossible, the stigma attached to Edith for having left him. But by this point, Wharton had largely moved to Europe anyway. She'd been spending more and more time in Paris, finding there a level of intellectual and social freedom she'd never had in New York. In Paris, her literary success made her a celebrated figure. She had a salon where writers, artists, and intellectuals gathered. She became friends with Henry James, who became one of her closest companions and literary influences. She had a passionate affair with Morton Fullerton, an American journalist living in Paris, her first real experience of romantic and sexual fulfillment at age 45. Her life in Europe was fuller, richer, more authentic than anything she'd known in New York. She'd escaped, physically and emotionally, from the world that had tried to confine her. But even as she was escaping, she continued to write about that world, examining it from every angle, exposing its hypocrisies and cruelties with surgical precision. Her 1913 novel, The Custom of the Country, is perhaps her most savage social satire, focusing on Undine Spragg, a beautiful, ambitious woman from the Midwest who uses marriage as a means of social climbing. Undine is the opposite of Lily Bart in many ways, where Lily is bound by moral constraints and unable to be ruthless enough to succeed. Undine has no moral constraints whatsoever. She's willing to do absolutely anything to get what she wants: status, wealth, and social position. She marries Ralph Marvell, a gentle, cultured man from old New York society, and destroys him through her selfishness and materialism. When his family's money isn't enough for her escalating demands, she divorces him and marries a nouveau rich businessman. When that becomes boring, she traps a French marquis into marriage, finally achieving the title she's always wanted. The Custom of the Country is Wharton's response to critics who thought she was too sympathetic to her characters, too gentle in her social criticism. Undine Spragg is a monster. But she's a monster created by a society that values women only for their beauty and their ability to attract wealthy men. Undine has simply taken the logic of that system to its extreme conclusion. If women are taught that their value lies entirely in their marketability, if they're trained from birth to be decorative and to catch rich husbands, if they're given no education or skills that would allow them to be productive members of society, then why shouldn't they use every weapon available to them to succeed in the only game they're allowed to play? Wharton shows us Undine's calculation, her manipulation, her complete lack of empathy, and she makes us understand that these qualities aren't aberrations, but the logical outcome of the way society treats women. The difference between Undine and the supposedly respectable society women who condemn her is that Undine is honest about what she's doing. She's playing the game for keeps, and she's winning. The novel also shows the clash between old money and new money with devastating clarity. Ralph Marvell's family represents old New York, cultured, refined, with deep roots and dwindling resources. They value things like taste, education, tradition, and family connections. Undine represents new money's complete indifference to all of that. She doesn't care about culture or tradition. She cares about appearances and possessions. She wants the biggest diamonds, the most fashionable clothes, to be seen in the right places with the right people. Ralph tries to educate her, to help her appreciate art and literature and history, and she finds it all boring and pointless. Why should she care about old paintings when she could be buying new jewelry? The tragedy is that Ralph's world is doomed. His family doesn't have enough money to compete with the new millionaires, and their cultural values don't matter in a world increasingly dominated by wealth without refinement. Undine's world is winning, and people like Ralph are being swept aside. What makes this novel particularly biting is that Wharton clearly has more sympathy for Ralph and his world than for Undine. But she also recognizes that his world is parasitic and useless in its own way. Old New York society looks down on the new millionaires as vulgar, but what exactly are the old families doing that's valuable? They're living off inherited wealth, congratulating themselves on their taste, and excluding anyone who doesn't meet their arbitrary standards. They're not creating anything, not contributing anything, just maintaining their little enclosed world and feeling superior. So when the new money sweeps in and pushes them aside, it's hard to feel too sorry for them. They had their chance to be more than ornamental, and they chose to cling to exclusivity instead. Wharton is critiquing both sides, the vulgar materialism of new money and the sterile snobbery of old money. Neither one offers a meaningful way to live. The custom of the country sold well, but received mixed reviews, with some critics finding Undine too unsympathetic to care about. But the novel has aged remarkably well, and many modern readers find it Wharton's most pointed social satire. Undine is recognizable as a certain type that still exists, the woman who uses her sexuality and beauty as tools to get what she wants, who sees relationships as transactional, who's always looking for the next upgrade. She's a social climber without a conscience, and she succeeds precisely because she's willing to do things that more decent people won't. The novel asks uncomfortable questions about what it takes to succeed in a materialistic society and whether the people who succeed are actually the winners, or whether they've lost something essential in the process. Throughout these years, Wharton was also producing volumes of short stories that explored similar themes from different angles. Stories like The Other Two examine the awkwardness of divorce and remarriage in a society not yet comfortable with such things. Bunner Sisters showed the desperate poverty and limited options of working-class women, a rare venture outside her usual upper-class milieu. Shingu satirized women's literary clubs and the pretensions of people who claim to be cultured without actually engaging with culture. These stories showed Wharton's range and her ability to find drama and meaning in various social situations. She was developing a comprehensive portrait of American society, particularly the East Coast upper classes, that was unmatched in its detail and psychological insight. When World War I broke out in 1914, Wharton was living in Paris, and she threw herself into war relief work with characteristic energy and organization. She established workrooms where unemployed women could work making clothes and supplies for refugees. She organized the Children of Flanders Rescue Committee to help Belgian refugee children. She visited the front lines multiple times, reporting on conditions and raising money for relief efforts. She wrote extensively about the war, producing articles, essays, and eventually a novel, The Marne, about the war's early days. Her relief work was recognized by the French government, which awarded her the Legion of Honor, making her the first woman to receive that honor for her humanitarian work. The war changed Wharton as it changed everyone who lived through it. The old world, the Gilded Age world she'd grown up in, was irrevocably gone, swept away by the catastrophe of the war. The social certainties, the assumption that civilization would continue progressing smoothly, the whole elaborate structure of European and American high society, it all seemed absurd and frivolous in the face of industrial-scale death and destruction. After the war, Wharton returned to fiction with renewed purpose. In 1920, she published The Age of Innocence, the novel that many consider her masterpiece and that won her the Pulitzer Prize, making her the first woman to win that award for fiction. The Age of Innocence is set in the New York of her youth, the 1870s, the world of old New York, just before the Gilded Age fully transformed it. It tells the story of Newland Archer, a young lawyer from a good family who's engaged to May Welland, a perfect society girl. Beautiful, docile, trained in every appropriate skill, and utterly conventional. Then Newland meets May's cousin, Ellen Olenska, a woman who has left her brutish Polish count husband and returned to New York seeking divorce and a new life. Ellen is everything May is not. Unconventional, European, sophisticated, passionate, and unafraid to speak her mind. Newland falls in love with her, and the novel traces his internal struggle between his desire for Ellen and his duty to May, between authentic feeling and social expectation. The Age of Innocence is Wharton's most nostalgic and yet most critical examination of old New York society. On one hand, she captures the beauty and order of that world, the sense of tradition and continuity, the genuine affection and loyalty that could exist within its constraints. The novel is full of loving detail about the rituals of that society, the opera nights and dinner parties, the summer retreats and winter balls, the unspoken understandings that govern behavior. There's a sense of something valuable being preserved in that enclosed world, a kind of civilization that would be lost in the more chaotic modern age. But at the same time, Wharton shows us the cost of that order, the way it crushes individual desire and authentic feeling in favor of maintaining appearances and following rules. Newland is trapped as surely as any of Wharton's female characters, trapped by his sense of duty and by the web of expectations that surround him. The genius of the novel is in showing how the trap works, not through obvious force, but through subtle pressure and internalized obligation. Nobody orders Newland to give up Ellen. His family and friends never explicitly threaten him. Instead, they use gentle manipulation, subtle guilt, and the invocation of duty to guide him into the expected path. When he considers breaking his engagement to May to be with Ellen, his family rallies around to prevent it, moving up the wedding date and making the break more difficult. When he considers running away with Ellen after his marriage, May reveals she's pregnant, trapping him with the most powerful obligation of all: fatherhood. Ellen herself, who's been taught the same code even as she's tried to escape it, ultimately tells him they can't be together because it would hurt too many people and destroy the small amount of freedom she's managed to carve out for herself. And so Newland sacrifices his chance for authentic love and settles into a conventional life with May, having children, building a respectable career, being exactly what he's supposed to be, while the passion and possibility he felt with Ellen remains forever unfulfilled. The final section of the novel, set decades later when Newland is in his 50s and May has died, is one of the most poignant passages in American literature. Newland is in Paris with his adult son, and they visit Ellen, who has been living there for years. But at the last moment, Newland can't bring himself to go up to see her. He sits on a bench outside her building while his son goes in alone, and he imagines what she looks like now, what she might say, and he realizes that the Ellen he loved exists only in his memory, that they're both different people now, that the moment of possibility is long past. He walks away without seeing her, returning to his hotel and his life, and the novel ends with him at peace with his choices, but also aware of everything he sacrificed. It's unbearably sad and yet somehow right, capturing the way people in that world lived with unfulfilled desires and roads not taken, and the way those sacrifices shaped who they became. The Age of Innocence is often read as Wharton's most sympathetic portrayal of old New York society, and in some ways it is. She wrote it after the war, when that world was completely gone, and there's definitely nostalgia in her depiction of its order and beauty. But nostalgia isn't the same as approval. The novel is still fundamentally a critique. Yes, old New York had its virtues, but those virtues came at enormous cost to individual freedom and happiness. Yes, there was something civilized about that world, but that civilization was built on repression and conformity. Yes, people like Newland and Ellen were capable of great self-sacrifice for the sake of others, but that self-sacrifice left them emotionally unfulfilled and living half-lives. Wharton is showing us both what was lost when that world ended and why it needed to end. Why its passing was ultimately necessary, even if some valuable things were lost in the process. The Pulitzer Prize for the Age of Innocence confirmed Wharton's status as one of America's most important living writers. She was 58 years old, living permanently in France, with a body of work that had consistently examined American society from every angle. She'd shown us the tragedy of women trapped by social expectations in the House of Mirth, the vulgarity of social climbing in the custom of the country, the nostalgic beauty and hidden cruelty of old New York in the Age of Innocence. She'd written about divorce, about marriage, about money, about class, about the clash between old money and new money, about the position of women, about the cost of conformity, about the conflict between duty and desire. She'd anatomized the Gilded Age so thoroughly that her novels remain our most detailed and psychologically penetrating source for understanding what that world was actually like from the inside. But Wharton wasn't done. She continued writing prolifically through the 1920s and into the 1930s, producing novels, short stories, essays, and criticism. Some of this later work is less highly regarded than her earlier novels, but it shows her continuing to grapple with changes in American society and her own position as a writer and observer. She was watching America transform in the 1920s, watching the Jazz Age replace the Gilded Age, and she didn't entirely approve of what she saw. She thought the new generation was too casual, too willing to abandon standards, too focused on immediate gratification. She'd spent her life critiquing the rigidity and hypocrisy of her parents' generation, but she also valued some of what that generation had stood for: craftsmanship, refinement, the idea that some things were worth preserving. Watching the wholesale rejection of tradition in the 1920s made her uncomfortable, even though she'd been instrumental in exposing the flaws of that tradition. Her 1927 novel, Twilight Sleep, satirized the 1920s obsession with therapy, spiritualism, and various fads. The title refers to a form of anesthesia used in childbirth, but it's also a metaphor for the way the novel's characters are trying to anesthetize themselves against any real feeling or engagement with life. They're constantly busy with activities, therapies, social causes, anything to avoid confronting the emptiness of their lives. It's a sharp satire of a certain type of privileged American woman who adopts every fashionable cause without real commitment, who fills her days with appointments and treatments and meetings, but never actually does anything meaningful. Wharton was showing that while the specific forms had changed, the fundamental hollowness of upper-class life remained. The Gilded Age had been about conspicuous consumption and rigid social rules. The 1920s were about constant stimulation and therapeutic self-involvement, but both were ways of avoiding authentic engagement with life. Throughout her career, Wharton's method remained consistent. She wrote from intimate knowledge, observing the world she knew with a clear eye, and recreating it in fiction with precision and psychological depth. She never tried to write about worlds she didn't know well. She didn't write about factory workers or farmers or immigrants except peripherally, because she didn't know those lives from the inside. But she knew her own world exhaustively, and she used that knowledge to create fiction that was both specific to that world and universal in its themes. The trap Lily Bard is caught in, needing to marry for money but wanting some authenticity in her choice, is specific to Gilded Age New York, but also speaks to anyone who's ever felt caught between economic necessity and personal desire. Newland Archer's choice between passion and duty is particular to his time and place, but also universal, the eternal conflict between what we want and what we owe to others. Undine Sprague's social climbing is specific to American society at the turn of the century, but also recognizable in any time or place where status matters and people are willing to use others to get ahead. What makes Wharton's exposure of the Gilded Age so effective is that it came from absolute insider knowledge combined with critical distance. She wasn't a journalist looking in from outside and misunderstanding what she saw. She wasn't a sensationalist trading in gossip and scandal. She was someone who had lived that life, who knew it intimately, who understood exactly how it worked and why people behaved the way they did. But she also had the analytical intelligence and moral clarity to see through the justifications and rationalizations, to recognize the system's fundamental injustices and hypocrisies. She knew that the women in beautiful gowns at glittering balls were also prisoners of a system that gave them no real choices. She knew that the civilized conversation and refined manners concealed ruthless social calculation and casual cruelty. She knew that the houses and jewels and parties were all part of a game played for social position, with people's lives and happiness as the stakes. And she had the literary skill to translate that knowledge into fiction that worked as fiction, not just as social documentary. Her novels have plots that grip readers, characters we care about, emotional stakes that matter. The House of Mirth isn't just a catalog of social practices. It's a tragedy that makes us feel Lily's desperation and pain. The Age of Innocence isn't just an anthropological study of old New York. It's a moving love story and a meditation on the roads not taken. The Custom of the Country isn't just a satire of social climbing. It's a darkly comic picaresque that keeps us reading to see what Undine will do next. Wharton understood that to effectively criticize a society, you have to make people care about the people trapped in that society. And she created characters vivid and human enough that we do care about them. Her prose style was perfectly suited to her material. It's elegant and precise, with a kind of cool, analytical quality that can suddenly give way to passages of real emotional power. She describes social situations with the precision of an anthropologist, capturing every subtle gesture and unspoken communication. But then she'll shift to a character's internal experience and show us their pain or desire or desperation with piercing clarity. She's particularly brilliant at dramatic irony, showing us the gap between what characters say and what they actually mean, between social appearance and emotional reality. In The Age of Innocence, there's a famous scene where May Welland, Newland's wife, reveals that she told Ellen that she was pregnant before she was actually certain, essentially lying to drive Ellen away from Newland. May does this while maintaining perfect social grace, never openly acknowledging what she's doing, and Newland only gradually realizes what's happened. The scene shows Wharton's mastery of subtext, the way people in her world communicated through indirection and implication, and the way social forms could be used as weapons. Wharton was also deeply concerned with the question of what makes a good life, what actually matters in a human life beyond social position and material success. Her novels consistently show characters who have everything society says should make them happy, but who are profoundly unhappy because they lack authentic connection, meaningful work, or genuine feeling. Lily Bart has beauty and social skills but no freedom or security. Newland Archer has a good career and a proper family, but no passion or authentic love. Undine Spragg gets the title and the jewels she's always wanted, but remains fundamentally empty and unsatisfied. Wharton's fiction suggests that the things society values, money and status and social position, are ultimately hollow if they're not accompanied by real human connection and authentic engagement with life. This is a profoundly moral vision, though it's never presented in a preachy or didactic way. She shows rather than tells, letting the fates of her characters speak for themselves. The question of Wharton's feminism is interesting and complicated. She was writing in an era when the women's suffrage movement was active, and she was certainly aware of the political debates around women's rights. But she never identified as a feminist or aligned herself with the suffrage movement, at least not publicly. Her novels expose the ways that society limits women's lives, showing the economic dependence, the lack of options, the double standards, all the mechanisms that trap women. But she doesn't offer clear solutions or call for political change. Her characters don't become revolutionaries or reformers. They mostly try to navigate the system as best they can, with varying degrees of success. Some readers have criticized Wharton for this, arguing that she saw the problems, but didn't push for solutions. But that may be unfair. Wharton was a novelist, not a political activist. Her job was to show the reality of women's lives as accurately as possible, and she did that brilliantly. She left the political solutions to others while providing an invaluable portrait of the problems that needed solving. It's also worth noting that Wharton's own life was a form of feminist rebellion, even if she didn't frame it that way. She claimed economic independence through her writing. She divorced an unsatisfactory husband at a time when divorce was scandalous. She lived on her own terms in France, surrounded by intellectual equals, having a rich creative and social life. She had at least one passionate affair, and probably others. She built a career that made her one of the most successful and respected writers of her era, male or female. She did all of this despite coming from a background that had tried to confine her to the role of decorative society wife. Her life proved that the constraints she depicted in her novels could be escaped, at least by women with sufficient intelligence, talent, and determination. She didn't write manifestos about women's rights, but she lived a life that demonstrated women's capabilities. Wharton's friendship and professional relationship with Henry James deserves attention because it shows her in the context of literary modernism and the development of the American novel. James was the established master when they met, 20 years older, and with a formidable body of work already completed. He pioneered the psychological novel and the intensive examination of consciousness that characterized literary modernism. Wharton learned from him, particularly in terms of technique, the use of point of view, the creation of complex character psychology, and the subtle revelation of character through action and dialogue. But she was never just an imitator. Her voice was her own, and in some ways, she was clearer and more direct than James, less baroque in her prose style, more willing to deliver straightforward social criticism. James's novels can be difficult, with their elaborate syntax and layers of qualification. Wharton's novels are generally more accessible while being equally sophisticated in their understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The two writers influenced each other and pushed each other to do their best work. They corresponded regularly, discussing their writing and critiquing each other's work. They visited each other, James coming to Wharton's homes in France and Wharton visiting James in England. Their friendship was genuine and deep, based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to the art of fiction. When James died in 1916, Wharton was devastated, losing one of her closest friends and most important intellectual companions. She wrote movingly about him, celebrating his genius while also acknowledging his personal quirks and difficulties. Their friendship represented what Wharton valued most: intellectual connection, artistic seriousness, and the ability to communicate with someone who understood what she was trying to accomplish in her work. If you're completely absorbed by how Edith Wharton transformed personal insight into literary art, and you want to explore more stories of how insiders became the greatest critics of their own worlds, make sure you subscribe, because we have so much more to uncover about the Gilded Age's secret rebellions and the people who documented them from within. In her later years, Wharton continued writing and published several more novels, including The Children in 1928 and The Gods Arrive in 1932. She also published an autobiography, A Backward Glance, in 1934, looking back on her life and the world she'd grown up in. The autobiography is interesting, but also revealing in what it leaves out or glosses over. She writes very little about her marriage to Teddy, almost nothing about her affair with Morton Fullerton, and presents a somewhat sanitized version of her early life. It's as if she was still bound by some of the conventions she'd spent her life critiquing in fiction, unable to be fully candid about her own experiences in a non-fiction format. Or perhaps she simply felt that her fiction had already told the important truths, and the specific autographical details didn't matter. Her novels were always more honest about emotional reality than any autobiography could be. She continued to live in France, eventually buying a house called Pavillon Colombe outside Paris and another property, Sticlaire Chateau, on the French Riviera. She maintained her garden passionately. Gardening was one of her great loves alongside writing. She traveled extensively, visiting Morocco, Italy, Spain, and England. She maintained a wide circle of literary and intellectual friends. She kept writing until very near the end of her life, working on fiction and criticism almost until her death from a stroke in 1937 at age 75. She died having published more than 40 books over nearly 40 years, having won the Pulitzer Prize, having been nominated for the Nobel Prize multiple times, and having established herself as one of the most important American writers of her generation. Wharton's reputation has fluctuated somewhat since her death, but her best work has never gone out of print, and scholarly and popular interest in her fiction has increased significantly in recent decades. Readers and critics have come to appreciate how ahead of her time she was in many ways, how her analysis of gender, class, and social power anticipated later feminist and sociological criticism. Her novels are taught in universities, adapted for film and television, and continue to find new audiences. The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence in particular remain widely read and admired, recognized as masterworks of American fiction. What makes Wharton's exposure of the Gilded Age still relevant today is that the fundamental dynamics she explored, the way that wealth shaped social relations, the way that women are trapped by economic dependence and social expectations, the way that society values appearance over substance, the way that individuals struggle between authentic desire and social obligation. All of these remain recognizable. The specific forms have changed. Women have more legal rights and economic opportunities now than they did in Wharton's time, though equality is far from complete. The social rules are different, less rigid and formal, though status hierarchies still exist and still shape people's lives. The extreme wealth inequality of the Gilded Age may have returned in some measures, with contemporary billionaires rivaling the robber barons in terms of concentrated wealth. But beneath these surface changes, the psychological and social dynamics Wharton explored remain relevant. Her novels ask us to think about how we measure success, what we're willing to sacrifice for social acceptance or material comfort, how we balance individual authenticity against social obligation, and what actually makes for a meaningful human life. These aren't questions specific to the Gilded Age. They're fundamental human questions that every generation has to answer for itself. Wharton's genius was in exploring these questions through precisely observed fiction that was simultaneously specific to her time and place and universal in its themes. She showed us her world so clearly that we recognize our own world in it, despite all the surface differences. The fact that she did this while being a woman from the upper class, the group that had the most invested in maintaining the system, makes her achievement even more remarkable. She could have written safely, producing conventional novels that celebrated her class and reinforced its values. Many women of her background did exactly that, writing romance novels and society novels that portrayed their world in flattering terms. Or she could have simply lived the life she was supposed to live, being a society hostess and never pushing beyond that role. Instead, she took enormous personal and professional risks to tell uncomfortable truths about her world. She faced criticism from people who thought she was betraying her class. She dealt with the personal cost of divorce and social disapproval. She worked incredibly hard to master the craft of fiction and to build a career as a professional writer in an era when that was unusual for women, and especially for women of her class. Her method of exposure was particularly effective because it was subtle. She wasn't writing polemics or political tracts. She was writing novels that worked as novels, with compelling characters and engaging plots. Readers who didn't want to think about social criticism could read her books simply as stories, enjoying the plots and characters without necessarily grappling with the deeper implications. But for readers willing to look deeper, the criticism was there, embedded in every choice her characters made and every consequence they faced. She showed rather than told, trusting her readers to draw their own conclusions from the evidence she presented. This made her criticism more effective than any explicit denunciation could have been, because readers arrived at the conclusions themselves rather than having them imposed from outside. Consider how she handles wealth in her novels. She doesn't tell us that wealth is corrupting or that rich people are bad. Instead, she shows us characters who have wealth and what they do with it, how it shapes their lives and choices, and what it costs them in terms of human connection and authentic feeling. Sometimes having money protects characters from consequences they'd otherwise face. Sometimes it isolates them and makes genuine connection impossible. Sometimes the pursuit of money drives characters to destroy themselves or others. She presents a complex, nuanced picture where wealth is neither simply good nor simply bad, but rather a powerful force that reveals character and shapes destiny in complicated ways. This complexity is much more persuasive than a simple moral would be. Similarly with gender, she doesn't lecture us about women's rights or the injustice of patriarchy. She simply shows us women's lives as they were lived, with all the constraints and limitations and double standards built in, and lets us see for ourselves how unjust the system was. Lily Bart's tragedy speaks louder than any political speech about why women need economic independence. Ellen Olenska's struggle to leave an abusive marriage and build an independent life shows why divorce rights matter. Mae Welland's perfect training in being a society wife shows the cost of raising women to be decorative rather than autonomous. The evidence is there in the fiction for anyone willing to see it. What's particularly brilliant about Wharton's approach is that she understood the system from the inside, including its appeal and its logic. She could have presented the Gilded Age as simply monstrous, a world of villains exploiting victims. But that wouldn't have been accurate or fair. The people in that world weren't monsters. They were human beings operating according to rules they'd internalized, pursuing goals that made sense within their framework, trying to live well according to the values they'd been taught. Mrs. Peniston, Lily Bart's aunt in the House of Mirth, isn't evil. She's simply conventional, unable to imagine any life for Lily outside the marriage market, genuinely believing she's acting in Lily's best interest, even as her rigid adherence to social rules contributes to Lily's destruction. Newland Archer's family, in the Age of Innocence, aren't trying to ruin his life. They're trying to protect him and maintain social stability according to their understanding of how society should work. Even Undine Spragg in The Custom of the Country, the closest thing to a villain in any Wharton novel, is recognizable as someone operating according to a certain logic, using the only tools she has to get what she wants, in a society that judges women primarily on their appearance and social success. This nuance makes Wharton's criticism more devastating because she can't be dismissed as simply not understanding her subjects. She understood perfectly. She understood the appeal of that world, the beauty and order and tradition that it offered. She understood why people defended it and fought to maintain it. And having understood all of that, having given it its due, she still concluded that the cost was too high, that the system's fundamental injustices and hypocrisies outweighed its virtues, that it needed to be exposed and eventually changed. Her criticism comes from knowledge rather than ignorance, from disappointed idealism rather than cynical rejection, and that makes it impossible to dismiss. The technical mastery of her best work is also worth appreciating. Wharton was a conscious, careful craftsperson who thought deeply about point of view, structure, pacing, and style. The House of Mirth is carefully constructed to show Lily's progressive fall, each section taking place a few months after the last, each one showing her in a slightly worse position than before, until the final devastating conclusion. The pacing is deliberate, giving us time to understand each stage of Lily's decline while maintaining narrative momentum. The Age of Innocence uses a different structure, covering several years but focusing on key moments that illuminate Newland's internal conflict, then jumping forward decades for the final section that shows the long-term consequences of his choices. The shift in time periods gives the novel its particular power, allowing us to see both the immediate pain of Newland's sacrifice and its ultimate meaning in the context of his whole life. Wharton's use of point of view is also sophisticated. She generally uses limited third-person perspective, staying close to a single character's consciousness, but maintaining enough distance to allow for irony. We see the world through Lily's eyes or Newland's eyes, but we also see things about them that they don't fully recognize about themselves. This allows Wharton to create dramatic irony, showing us the gap between how characters understand themselves and what they actually are, between their intentions and the results of their actions. It's a technique she learned partly from Henry James, but she uses it in her own way, generally with more clarity and less ambiguity than James's work typically displays. Her attention to physical detail and setting is also crucial to how her novels work. She describes houses, clothes, food, social rituals, all the material culture of her world with precise attention to detail. This isn't just for verisimilitude or atmosphere, though it certainly creates both. The details are symbolic and revelatory. The house someone lives in, how it's decorated, what's served at their dinner table, what they wear to the opera, all of this communicates information about their social position, their values, their financial situation, and their character. In The House of Mirth, Lily's progressive economic decline is marked by changes in where she lives and what she wears. In The Age of Innocence, the difference between Ellen Olenska's bohemian house and May Welland's conventional one tells us everything about the difference between the two women. Wharton uses material culture the way other writers use dialogue or action, as a way of revealing character and advancing themes. The question of Wharton's legacy brings us finally to consider her place in American literature and cultural history. She's sometimes overshadowed by male contemporaries like Henry James or F. Scott Fitzgerald, but her work is as accomplished as theirs and in some ways more accessible and emotionally direct. She deserves recognition as one of the great American novelists, someone who captured a crucial period in American history with unmatched precision and insight. Her best novels, The House of Mirth, The Custom of the Country, and The Age of Innocence, are permanent contributions to American literature, books that will continue to be read as long as people care about finely crafted fiction that illuminates human experience. But beyond her literary achievement, Wharton's importance lies in the historical record she created. She documented the Gilded Age from the inside with a novelist's eye for psychological truth and a social critic's awareness of injustice. Her fiction is an invaluable source for historians and anyone interested in understanding what that era was actually like, not just the external facts, but the internal experience, what it felt like to live in that world, what people thought and felt and desired, how they navigated their social environment, what they sacrificed and what they gained. She textured of that life in a way that no purely historical account could do. She also provided a model for how insider critique can work, how someone from a privileged background can use their knowledge and position to expose injustice rather than simply defending their own privilege. This remains relevant today when we think about who has authority to critique various systems and institutions. Wharton proved that insiders can be the most effective critics precisely because they can't be dismissed as ignorant outsiders who don't understand what they're criticizing. She knew her world completely, and that knowledge made her critique unanswerable. The particular concerns she explored about women's economic dependence, about the gap between appearance and reality in social life, about the cost of conformity, about the conflict between individual authenticity and social obligation, remain relevant to contemporary readers, even though the specific social forms have changed dramatically. We don't live in a world of formal calls and rigid dress codes and chaperoned courtships anymore. But we still live in a world where economic inequality shapes people's options and opportunities. We still live in a world where women face constraints and expectations based on gender. We still live in a world where people struggle to balance authentic desire against social and economic pressures. Wharton's fiction continues to speak to these experiences even across the distance of more than a century. Reading Wharton today is a strange experience because her world is so foreign in its surface details, yet so recognizable in its underlying dynamics. The formal dinners and opera boxes and calling cards are gone, but the social jockeying for position remains. The specific constraints on women have changed, but gender inequality persists in different forms. The robber barons and society queens she wrote about are gone, but extreme wealth and its influence remain very much with us. Her novels work as period pieces, transporting us to a vanished world, but they also work as contemporary social criticism because the fundamental human and social issues she explored haven't been resolved. What we can learn from Wharton is both the power of fiction to expose social injustice and the importance of telling uncomfortable truths, even when, especially when, those truths implicate your own community and class. She risked social disapproval and alienation from her own background to tell the truth about what she saw. She refused to prettify or excuse the injustices of her world, even though she came from that world and had benefited from its privileges. She used her considerable literary gifts to create fiction that was simultaneously beautiful and damning, that entertained while it criticized, that captured a world even as it condemned much of what that world stood for. In the end, Edith Wharton exposed the Gilded Age by living through it with her eyes open, by refusing to accept the comfortable lies and self-justifications that allowed others to ignore its injustices, and by translating what she saw into fiction of lasting power and relevance. She took the raw material of her own experience, the ballrooms and drawing rooms, the social calls and dinner parties, the marriages of convenience and social climbing and desperate attempts to maintain position, and she turned it into art that revealed fundamental truths about human nature and social organization. She showed us that beneath the gilded surface was a world of genuine suffering and limited options, of women trapped by their own beauty and trained helplessness, of men trapped by duty and convention, of a social system that valued appearance over authenticity and wealth over humanity. She did this not as an outsider looking in with incomprehension or judgment, but as an insider looking around with clear eyes and a moral compass. She did it not in one explosive expose, but gradually, systematically, novel by novel, story by story, building a comprehensive portrait of her world that remains unmatched in its detail and psychological insight. She did it with such literary skill that even people who didn't want to confront her social criticism were compelled by her plots and characters and prose. And she did it knowing that she was betraying, in some sense, the world she came from, the people who had raised her and shaped her, the class that had given her the material comfort and social position that had made her writing possible in the first place. That betrayal, if we can call it that, was actually a profound act of honesty and courage. Edith Wharton looked at the world she knew best and told the truth about it, even though that truth was uncomfortable and unflattering. She showed us the human cost of extreme inequality, of rigid social hierarchies, of a system that treated women as decorative objects rather than autonomous individuals, of a world where appearance mattered more than substance and social position more than human connection. She did it page by page, scene by scene, character by character, building through accumulated detail and psychological insight, a portrait so accurate and penetrating that it remains our best source for understanding what the Gilded Age was really like from the inside. Her novels are time capsules that preserve that vanished world in all its complexity, beautiful and ugly, civilized and cruel, ordered and oppressive. They're also timeless explorations of human nature and social dynamics that remain relevant long after the specific social forms she described have disappeared. And they're testaments to the power of literature to reveal truth, to the possibility that an individual with talent and courage can bear witness to their times in ways that matter long after those times have passed. Edith Wharton exposed the Gilded Age, one page at a time, and in doing so, she created something permanent and valuable, a body of work that continues to teach us about that era and about ourselves. Her life and work prove that the pen truly can be mightier than the sword, that fiction can be a form of truth-telling, and that bearing witness to your own time with honesty and courage is one of the most important things a writer can do. That's her legacy, and it remains as vital and necessary today as it was when she was writing over a century ago.